Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm delighted today to be talking with my very old and dear friend, Peter Wehner, about the current crisis. Pete and I go way back. I served in the Reagan administration. You served in the George W. Bush administration. You were much more high-ranking than I was, I have to confess, But I did have a blue pass, which allowed me to go anywhere. That was because I worked for the First Lady. Anyway, welcome, Pete. Good to see you.
Great to be with you, Mona. Thank you. And thanks for your voice in these disorienting times.
Ditto, right back at you. All right. For our viewers and listeners who may not be familiar with this, I'd like to go back a little bit and talk about PEPFAR. It's been in the news, obviously, lately, because it was part of USAID and it's now discontinued. And you were there when this program was initiated under George W. Bush. The estimates range widely, but it is certainly tens of millions of people whose lives have been saved by this program. So I want to begin with you taking us through how it began and why. I mean, if you listen to many analysts these days, they'll say, you couldn't possibly get such a program off the ground. It basically helps poor people in countries far away. We get nothing out of it. Why would we do such a thing?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it because PEPFAR is one of the great success stories in the American story, certainly from a humanitarian perspective. And the context is that there was a terrible outbreak of AIDS on primarily the African continent in the late 90s, early 2000s. And there would be in places like Uganda, they would refer to these roads as coffin rows because they were just having to build coffins. It was essentially a HIV/AIDS was a death sentence. And so in the Bush administration, we had conversations with people, Mark Diebold, who was a brilliant scientist at the National Institutes of Health, Tony Fauci, who was at NIH at that point as well, and a specialist in infectious diseases, and others, some from the outside. The singer-songwriter Bono had an interest in this topic as well. And so there were conversations in the White House between them and various people within the administration. And that included Josh Bolten,
who was chief of staff at the time.
He was deputy chief of staff at the time.
Okay.
He became chief of staff in the second term. And Josh is a wonderful and supremely able person. Mike Gerson, who was my closest friend, he was a key advisor and chief speechwriter for President Bush. President Bush himself developed an interest in this, and others within the administration. And then it really was a process of thinking through in as systematically a way as possible. What's the problem? What's needed? And how can we create the drugs and the treatments and a whole range of prevention techniques to try and keep AIDS from spreading. And once that was figured out, President Bush went all in, and he announced it as State of the Union speech. And I think it was the 2003 State of the Union speech. I may be wrong on the date. And it was at that time the largest investment in a single disease in human history. And it had stunning effects. And right now the estimates are in the range of between 25 and 30 million people have been saved by PEPFAR. Subsequent administrations supported, in the Obama administration supported it and built on it. And up until recently, it was viewed as a not just a successful program, but a bipartisan program, really beyond controversy.
How did Republicans on the Hill and around the country, governors, other, just leading Republicans react to this? Did they say this was not our problem, let someone else do it? We're not interested in poor Black people, babies in Africa.
Yeah.
What kind of pushback did you get?
There wasn't much pushback. The Senator Helms, this is in the late 90s, actually was brought on board in part by Bono into helping people in Africa in the context of AIDS.
Tell people about who that was.
Yeah, Jesse Helms was a North Carolina senator for many, many decades, been a segregationist, very conservative, right-wing, and a person who I think temperamentally was an obstructionist. So he was difficult even for President you served, and I was in that administration too, Ronald Reagan and others. He was just a kind of thorn in the side, but extremely popular in North Carolina, particularly in the rural regions of North Carolina. But he was brought along, and that is really what you need to do in politics, is you have to make unlikely alliances, and that happened. Once we promoted the Global AIDS Initiative, we were the driving force behind it. It wasn't as if there were a lot of Republicans that were cheering it on, but they certainly didn't oppose it. And there were various people within Congress that were key allies in that effort. Some of them were in the pro-life movement, which was nice because this was a pro-life initiative. And then even within the evangelical world,
let's pause on that for a minute. Let's pause on that because people with justification, seeing what the pro-life movement is now, a cheering section for MAGA in so many instances, can ask, how could you ever have been associated with a movement like that? Right. And they say to me,
Yeah.
And I say, it wasn't like that. I had good reason to think these people were sincere and really cared about human life. And this is a perfect example. They got behind a program whose purpose was to help lots of people, but a lot of them were mothers and babies in Africa, where they were going to, the whole, one of the best things about the PEPFAR program is that it prevented maternal to infant transmission of AIDS with the right drugs. And this was a pro-life initiative, completely. Right. And pro-life people were behind it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And yeah, I had the same experience. I mean, in my dealings with people of the pro-life movement, I respected them. And I felt like they were in the movement and in part of that cause because they really genuinely believed in it. Now, abortion is a complicated moral issue, I think. I've always thought that to be the case. But my instincts, my tropisms were always to be to pro-life, if uncertain, give the benefit of the doubt. But that, even with me, that came with caveats. But that, I think, was very, very sincere. I don't think that many of the people who were pro-life, who are now Trumpian, were necessarily cynical back then. And in fact, I wouldn't say that in a sweeping way about a lot of the people who were MAGA. I think at the time they were authentic in what they believed. I think they changed. I don't think the through line here has been cynicism and power. I think it's actually kind of a weak character that was exposed in the Trump moment. But I wouldn't go back and make sweeping characterizations of the pro-life movement as negative. And even to this day, there are still people who are authentically concerned with life, the life movement. I do think that what the pro-life movement has become is an illustration, kind of CAT scan, both on human nature and politics and the power of the Trump cult, because they really have jettisoned some of their deepest convictions. I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is head of Health and Human Services, which is the single most important federal agency, as you know, on the issue of abortion. As recently as last year, he was in favor of abortion up to the moment of birth, you could hardly have chosen somebody who was more pro-choice in that position. Trump himself is de facto pro-choice. Now, when you and I were serving in mid-administrations and involved in politics, the slightest deviation from what they consider to be the orthodoxy would have caused an uproar in the pro-life movement. That's now been basically shut down, shut out. And in fact, there are certain people in the pro-life movement who really were the tip of the spear in the attacks on PEPFAR, which is now being gutted. It started in the Heritage Foundation, which is a far-right populist nationalist, ethnic nationalist think tank. When you and I were around, it was a Reaganite conservative think tank, and so like everything else, seemingly, even PEPFAR has gotten sucked into the maw of this contentious, destructive, in this case, lethal politics.
One would even venture to say regarding RFK Jr. that even if he had not been as pro-choice as he was and is, the threat he poses to innocent life is so stark that an organization thinking of itself as pro-life wouldn't have been able to support him anyway, just on vaccines alone.
Yeah.
You talked about how you believe the movement, many people in the movement, they were not insincere then, but they have changed. And I tend to agree with that. Yeah, there are individual exceptions, of course, but I do tend to believe that. And I think it underscores the importance of leadership. And most people are not, rock-ribbed ideologues or principled people. They're they're moldable and very susceptible to influence and leadership and direction. I mean, in my darker moments, I think they are sheep, who with a few little nips from a border collie will go this way or that. But let's talk about, because this is something you've addressed many times and very eloquently, and so I think it's good now to turn to it, because you talk about the importance of the lying. And what I gleaned from reading you and also thinking about these things on my own is that the lying is so important for laying the predicate. If you are someone like Trump who is badly motivated and wants other people to follow his kind of politics of revenge, hatred, persecuting those he dislikes, you cannot get people to follow you in that without making them think at some level they're on the right side or they're being defensive. They're only fighting back. Right. So talk about that in relation to the lies that they tell, QAnon, immigrants are criminals, all of that sort of thing.
It's a really good question. It's a deep question, and it really intersects politics with human psychology, which I think is extremely important to understand. Let me deal with that in two ways, and maybe deal with the second point you raised first, which is this kind of cognitive dissonance that goes on. I agree with you. Most people are not wired in a way that they are comfortable living what they themselves know is a lie, or being part of a malicious movement that they know is a malicious movement. That just creates too much internal conflict. So the question is, well, when they do become part of that, what happens? And as I understand it from talking to clinical psychologists and others, that the mind has defense mechanisms, because it kind of kicks in to mitigate what psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, this clash of values against each other. And so what people have to do is to convince themselves and then to convince the people around them that they're on the right side. And that requires them to go through a whole series of self-manipulation, which then becomes a broader manipulation of the world around them. So they have to create scenarios and pseudo-realities that says, yes, I'm on the right side. Now that may be that they just believe, in the case of Donald Trump, that what he is saying is true. They may, and these are not mutually exclusive, have convinced themselves that we're in an existential moment, so-called Flight 93 moment. And so the usual rules that govern behavior need to be jettisoned because the stakes are so high. And if we lose this battle, this election, then almost everything we cherish and love will collapse and die. There's often the need for people within MAGA world to elevate the corruption of the other side, right? Not many people who are not in Trump's immediate sphere would say that he's a man of sterling moral character. What they do, in my experience, is they downplay his maliciousness, his malignancy. You know, in the early days of this movement, the manifestation was, he's a little rough around the edges. He sends out tweets that are too crude, as if that was the sum total of the borderless corruptions of Donald Trump are the worst thing. So that's the first thing that has to happen. You have to mitigate the maliciousness, the malevolence of Donald Trump. And then that they have to do is they have to escalate the maliciousness, the corruption of whoever it is they're against. So anybody who is, in line as a presidential candidate for the Democrats or another figure has to be turned into a caricature, because what they're looking for essentially is a draw on the morality. No one's perfect. Corrupt Joe Biden, corrupt Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump's got his problems, so let's call it a draw. And then they move and they say, but he's the best thing here or there, or on an array of policies. So that's my experience of what happens.
Can I just underline that? I mean, I just want to draw a big dark line underneath that, because that's my experience too. Is that this is the essential, the first step in the moral failure of people who make these excuses, is that they go to, well, everybody does it.
Right.
Nobody's perfect to some degree. All politicians lie. I remember having this conversation with somebody early on in the Trump years when I was saying, he's attempting to obliterate truth itself.
Yes.
And make us, utterly unable to deal with reality. And they said, oh, come on, don't be naive. All politicians lie. And that is the beginning of sacrificing your own capacity to make distinctions and to make judgments, right? You just say, well, they all do it. And that relieves you of the obligation to struggle with what's right in front of your face, which is, no, there are liars and then there are complete fantasists.
Yeah, no, that is exactly right. And it's very well stated. I don't know if you ever had this experience. I have, which is when I've had discussions with Trump supporters, and I'm sure you've experienced this too. It creates its own complexities relationally. But in any event, I have tried to stay in conversation and in touch with them. And in times in which I've talked to them, and I've done this in a very non-polemical way, but I've tried to say, look, let's set aside your complaints about Joe Biden or the left or wokeness, some of which I agree with, some I wouldn't, but let's just set that aside and let's just focus in on the particulars of what Donald Trump has done. Let's just talk about that. And then I would go through, because I was pretty well acquainted with what he's done, the factual basis for it. And when I would do that, what I experienced is asking a Trump supporter, a Trump voter, to look at what he has done. And the facts of what he has done is like asking them to stare into the sun. They'll do it for just a split second and then they'll look away because it's too hard, it's too painful. And so they immediately want to change the conversation. Mm-hmm. They may give you a sentence or two, but then they'll try and pivot. But what about? And then it's the whataboutism phenomenon. Again, I think that this is rooted, at least in large part, on a psychological reaction, because they don't. I've had this with people who have been ministers, and I remember a breakfast where I would go through, and he would make general characterizations of Donald Trump, and then he would dismiss some of the things, and then I would go through and I would say, well, actually, this is the factual basis for it, and so he was not a strong Trump supporter, but he was a Trump voter. And he, every time I went through the particulars, he wanted to downplay them because he knew that there was a conflict in his case between being a person who's a minister and voting for Trump. The other thing that you mentioned that I wanted to underscore is that you used the phrase that Trump wants to obliterate truth itself. And that's an extremely important thing in terms of now here political psychology, disinformation and misinformation. Most politicians tell half-truths, sometimes they tell lies, but that is categorically different than people who want to annihilate truth itself, because that has a different purpose. If you're out to annihilate truth itself, it isn't simply that you're trying to get people to agree with the lie that you're telling, although you welcome that and you want that. But the deeper purpose is to create a disorientation in the public, a confusion. It's just an epistemological confusion. There's so much disinformation flood the zone that people begin to wonder, what can I believe at all? And that is the opening that authoritarian leaders throughout history have needed. And what makes it particularly challenging in this era, when you and I were working in various administrations, misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories existed, but they were contained. They were kept on the fringe. I do think that social media has changed because it does a couple of things. One is it creates an almost instant community among people, which is really important because a lot of people are lonely and isolated. So this creates a community which is self-reinforcing. The other thing it does, and I'm guessing you've experienced this as I have, which is it gives them the capacity to link to some kind of study, no matter how harebrained, no matter how fictional that it is. And they just link it and they send it because that's all they need is a foothold for themselves to say, well, you say tomato, I say tomato. You say hydroxychloroquine doesn't cure COVID, I say it does. Look at this 45-minute video, nicely made video of a registered nurse, in Tuscaloosa going through it. I've had that. I've actually had someone send that to me, someone close to me. And I went through and I probably spent 2.5 hours as a favor to this person refuting those charges. But I understood, somebody knew a little bit about this topic. It took me a while so it takes real energy to try and bat down all of these lies. People like Trump know it. So they just overwhelm the public. And pretty soon the public, even if they're not necessarily pro-Trump, thinks, gosh, everybody can make up their own script. What do I believe? And that is part of the authoritarian takeover effort.
It makes people despair that the truth is discoverable by them.
Exactly.
And so when they think, well, there's no way for me to figure out what's real and what's not, might as well go with where my gut is. And I kind of like conservatives, or I kind of like tough guys, or I kind of like whatever. And so I'm choosing to think that it's true because it really requires too much effort to figure out the truth.
That's right.
And that is an epistemological problem that we are going to be living with for a while. It's been observed many times that we are in one of those eras with new technology, which causes tremendous disruption until we get our arms around it and figure out, like, okay, there has to be a way to organize all of this. I mean, it happened with the printing press and with radio, right. And it's always the case that the bad actors seem to figure out how to use new technology before the good ones catch up.
Yeah. And I'll tell you something on that, Mona, which will resonate with you, because your journey and mine are so similar, intellectually, politically, where we are now. Nietzsche had a phrase for what you just described: perspectivism. Everything is determined by your own perspective. There's no objective truth. You kind of bend reality to whoever's the strongest. What makes this, I think, particularly painful for me, and I'm guessing for you, is that the people who are most responsible for this kind of Nietzschean ethic, both in terms of the assault on truth and the will to power and the sheer brutality of civic and political life now, are people on the right and conservatives. And when we were young, you'll remember Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. I think it was published in 1987, which caused a kind of earthquake, among not just academic circles. It was a New York Times bestseller.
It was a bestseller, yeah.
It was. And he was a revered professor at University of Chicago. A number of our friends knew him, studied under him. And it's a very powerful book. It's a dense book, but it opens with his account of students and their relativism. And he has an entire chapter. The book is filled with these references to Nietzsche, which he was against and conservatives were against. Conservatives were on the side of arguing against relativism, against subjectivism, about objective truth.
Yes. And
that was so deeply embedded into the conservative mindset. It was one of the things that drew me to it, at that time, and to have seen not only that they've broken away from that, but that it's flipped, and now that they themselves are the champion. That's why I don't even refer to them as conservatives. I just don't think in fundamental ways they're conservative. I think they're nihilists, they're ethnic nationalists, they're populists, but that isn't conservatism, at least the kind that you and I were brought up on, and what went over our loyalties.
Yeah. And that's why I started with PEPFAR, because I just wanted the audience who's younger and may not, have memories of that time to know that it was part of being a conservative to be concerned about the least of these,
right.
to want to help people who couldn't help themselves and who needed it. And that was, seeing the United States, part of it was religious. I know that Bush himself was a born-again Christian, and that was part of the motivation, but that was not the whole motivation. It was the whole conservative movement at the time, or at least a lot of it, perceived the U.S. as being a benevolent country, as being as a place where, welcoming to refugees and immigrants and providing a better life for everyone, and attempting to heal the rifts of the past and get over our history of racism, and to extend a helping hand because we were wealthy and were able to, and were generous to people around the world who needed it. And that was all part of our identity as conservatives. Such a big part of our identity, and also standing up for freedom-loving people around the world against oppressors of various kinds. And I remember taking particular pride, sorry for the soliloquy here, but I remember taking particular pride that in the Cold War, we not only defended people who were anti-communist, and sometimes there's no question we did make common cause with some bad actors because they were broadly on our side against the USSR and China and whatever. That was true. But we also put pressure sometimes on our own side to hold elections, to respect human rights, to abide by their agreements and so forth, to open up their press. Those things were all true as well, because we did have certain principles.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that sort of journey down memory lane. It makes the present moment even more painful. But you're absolutely right. I remember these conversations just like you do. I never really had a sense, and I've served in 3 Republican administrations in varying degrees. I don't really have a memory of thinking that I was in the company of people that wanted to do ill and knew
No.
that they were doing ill. The argument, different people have different roles in administrations and so forth. And but in terms of my experience with it, I think I was kind of hardwired to view much of life through a moral lens. I don't say that as a particular virtue. I just think it's sort of how I came out.
Yep.
And
Same. Yeah.
it's just a kind of reflex. And that didn't collide with people. There were arguments about discernment, about discretionary judgments. Just as you said, let's say that there are authoritarian countries in the 1980s that were not living up to human rights like we felt that they should. But it was also perceived that they were a bulwark against communism and totalitarianism. Do you support them or not? How do you support them? What kind of efforts are you making behind the scenes to get them to change? If that doesn't work, do you publicly break with them? Those are legit questions, and those are the kind of questions you have in normal administrations.
Right. And they're not easy.
And they're not easy. And often you just have to recalibrate, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what life is often. You try one thing, new facts, new circumstances, things you didn't anticipate, and you try and change as you go. But that issue that you raised, which was really central to the conservatism of our era, which was morality as a centerpiece for foreign policy. And that was in large part actually an advent of Reagan himself, because with Kissinger and Nixon and Ford, Kissinger was a brilliant man, but he's European, he was realpolitik. You'll remember when they didn't invite Solzhenitsyn to meet with Ford in the White House, and that created quite an uprising among some people who were conservative. Reagan came in and was very conscious about saying morality is going to be a centerpiece of foreign policy, and that really was a through line for a generation or two, really up until Trump. So that was what the conservative movement was about. It doesn't mean that it was perfect. It doesn't mean, when I think back, are there things that I should have been more alert to? What should I have seen? Were there things that I was justifying that in retrospect, maybe I'm not comfortable doing? Were there worse actors than I was willing to acknowledge? Those are all legitimate things to ask oneself and for others to ask me about. But as a whole, the movement was not what you see now. And as I said earlier, I'm not even sure a lot of people who were comfortable in the kind of Reagan-Bush era, who are now completely at home in the Trump era. I think they probably in large part believe what they believed then, and they believe what they believe now. And they have constructed a false reality that allows them to have made peace with now living a life and standing for principles that were fundamentally at odds for what they once believed.
Spring is so often the busy season, you don't have a lot of time to go grocery shopping or to cook healthy meals at home. Hungry Root is like having your own personal shopper and nutritionist all wrapped into one. They take care of the weekly grocery shopping, recommending healthy groceries and meals tailored to your tastes, nutrition preferences, and health goals. With Hungry Root, it's easy to eat high-quality, nutritious food and achieve any diet or health goals, from anti-inflammatory to gut-friendly, gluten-free or dairy-free, high protein, so much more. You can relieve so much stress by letting them take care of the shopping and planning. Just tell them about your goals and preferences, and they fill your cart with personalized recommendations that get smarter as they learn more about what you liked or didn't love. Most of Hungry Root's recipes can be made in just 15 minutes or less. With over 15,000 recipes shipped each week, there's something for every taste and nutrition preference. Hungry Root also has healthy groceries like smoothies, kids' snacks, sweets, ready-to-eat meals, salad kits, and even supplements. And moreover, there's no high-fructose corn syrup, artificial sweeteners, or preservatives in any of Hungry Root's food. They only source top quality meat and seafood free of hormones and antibiotics. I have to say, this is so important for me because late in life, I've realized that I have an intolerance for high fructose corn syrup, which is in so many products. It's in like regular ketchup and it's in drinks. It's in all kinds of, it's hidden. And I also have an intolerance of artificial sweeteners. They don't agree with me. So I love the fact that Hungry Root does that, just eliminates that issue for me entirely. You can take advantage of this exclusive offer. For a limited time, get 40% off your first box, plus get a free item in every box for life. Go to hungryroot.com/Charen and use code Charen. That's hungryroot.com/Charen, code Charen, to get 40% off your first box and a free item of your choice for life. hungryroot.com/Charen, code Charen. One way to judge that the movements are quite different is to look at the way MAGA has such contempt for Reagan and Reaganism. I remember engaging on what was then Twitter. I've since basically almost completely checked out of that site, but every now and then my stuff is posted there and I take a look. But in the day I was on there and I would get these messages from people saying, when I would say we need to uphold these values or whatever, and I would hear from the MAGA people who would say, we want no part of zombie Reaganism, right?
Right.
So
Right.
they saw a clear distinction and they wanted no part of it. So they made that very obvious. One of the other matters that you've touched on in your writing is the role of Christians. And, again, harking back to the way it was in the past, I might have had certain reservations about the role of evangelicals in the Republican Party. There were certain things that I wouldn't necessarily have had the same views on. But in general, I thought they were a force for good. I thought they were principled. And I certainly thought they would not be, I thought they would be the last ones to fall in line behind a character quite as corrupted and vicious as Trump. But when you mix the cultism of and the joy of breaking things, which I think you wrote about also, with a kind of religious zeal that the Christians bring, that is now beginning to feel really dangerous.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think at this moment, and it has been for the last 10 years, the contributions that Christians have made to politics is far and away a net negative versus the positives, and that hasn't always been the case. Yeah, if I step back, I mean, I'd say several things about that. The first is that the reality is that throughout the entire history of Christianity, 2,000 years, it's a pretty mixed record. I mean, there have been moments of glory and promotion of human dignity, the Imago Dei, the notion that we're all made in the image of God, which is Jewish and Christian, in terms of the American experience. You had the abolition movement, and civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. and many others that you could cite. But you had really moments of real horror. And that has been part of the Christian history as well. Now, if you go into modern times, this is kind of a shortened version of it. Christians for much of the 20th century were sort of disengaged from politics. Some of it was theological. It was a notion that we're here to save souls. This world is not our home, right? Jerry Falwell Sr. was actually in the 60s. That was where he was. He was really distanced himself from politics. There was a change that occurred. It was somewhat theological. I think it was justified theologically in part, and some of it was driven by theology. But they then decided we're going to get involved in politics for a variety of reasons. Several issues came together in the 70s. abortion, forced busing, some issues related to race and others. Christians decided to get involved. 79, the moral majority starts, Jerry Falwell Sr., Pat Robertson, the 700 Club. 1980, they go with Reagan, right? In the mid-70s, in the race between Carter and Ford, evangelicals split. And more evangelicals identified as Democrats in 76 than identified as Republicans. Reagan changes that. He wins 2/3 of white evangelical votes.
Right?
Right, exactly, in 80. And then 3/4 with Mondale. And ever since, it's been in that range. The influence of Christians at that point in politics, I would say, was mixed. There were, I think, very healthy efforts in the pro-life movement, mostly Catholics, quite honestly, but other efforts as well. But there was also this extremist rhetoric, this sense of existential fear that you really see in the rhetoric of Falwell and Robertson and many others at that time. And when there's another thing that maybe your listeners would be interested in, and Chuck Colson said this, and this is my experience true. It's essentially that there is no group that is as easily seduced by power as Christians. And Colson said it. He was, as you know, a hatchet man in the Nixon years. He had a conversion after Watergate, and really did change his life. Had a transformed life.
He really did, yeah.
Prison fellowship and other things. But that is, I think, true, and I think part of it is David Brooks has used the phrasing that for a lot of Christians, evangelical Christians, it's a moral superiority, intellectual inferiority complex.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And the intellectual inferiority complex is the sense of longing to be accepted in the halls of power. And that's not just the White House, it's universities. Part of the reason that there's so much resentment against Harvard and Yale and Princeton isn't because they hate those institutions. It's that they're not respected by those institutions, and they want to be. Mm-hmm. And so if the imagery that I've long had of Christians when it relates to political power is like kids with their face pressed against a candy store or a toy store, longing to get in, longing to be recognized. And that was certainly the case when it comes to politics.
Wait, Pete, can I stop you there? Because I have questions. So to what degree is this class-based? Because, an outsider looking in at the Ivy League until like the late 1970s when they started or 60s and 70s when they started accepting Jews and other minorities, right, they would say, what do you mean Christians weren't welcome there? They were Christian institutions. They were run by the Protestant elite in this country. So now they may not have been fundamentalists. They definitely weren't, but they were certainly Christian. Is it a class thing?
I think it's partly a class thing. And I think part of it too is the sense, you're certainly right. I mean, if you go back historically, I mean, a lot of the universities, starting with Harvard, were religious institutions, and it was Christian religious institutions. But if we're talking about the last half century or so, I think what happened is that Christians felt, and in many respects, this was rooted in reality, or at least for portions of reality, there was a contempt and a sense that Christians felt they dishonor us, they disrespect us. The elite culture, the elite institutions, Washington Post, New York Times, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Ivy League, Hollywood, and so forth. And it wasn't directed at them because they were Christian per se. I always thought there was a conflation. It was that a lot of Christians, evangelical Christians, had a worldview that was traditional and conservative, particularly on matters of human sexuality. If you were a liberal Christian, a progressive Christian, you wouldn't be mocked by elite culture. They would have thought, okay, well, here's an ally in our cause. So I think the genesis of it was this sense that we have with what they believed were conservative, traditional Christian values, and these elite institutions decided to go after them and mock them and ridicule them. And again, some of that went on. But even if you go back to the 20th century, in terms of evangelical Christians and Christians more broadly, there was the Scopes Monkey trial in 1929, which, they won the case, but they lost the country.
Yeah.
Because it was essentially Christians saying that evolution was untrue. It was William Jennings Bryan was the advocate, the lawyer for the creationist, non-evolutionary side. And his argument was evolution can't be true because if evolution is true, then the entire Bible collapses. There's no authority in Scripture, and that can't happen. So this is a fundamental attack on what we believe. There was such a blowback against it because evolution is true, and this collision against science was lost because science was true. And this caused a pullback emotionally as well as practically from a lot of Christians, and it played into that inferiority complex.
By the way, if I could just add a footnote, H.L. Mencken did a lot to make Christians feel humiliated because his commentary that got a lot of attention about that trial was dripping with contempt.
Absolutely. Yeah. He himself, it turned out, was a very questionable character.
Very bad guy.
very, very bad cat.
Yeah.
And so that absolutely is true. So I think a lot of that just kind of played into it. We're all products of history, even histories before we were born. So I think that was kind of the context in which Christians are easily seduced by power. So then you kind of fast forward to the question that you originally asked, which is, how is it that people that claimed that moral character was primus inter pares for political leaders mattered above all? That even if a person has good policies, if they are questionable morally and ethically, even in their private life, that's a disqualifier. So you go to Trump year, the Clinton years, right?
Yep.
And people, particularly evangelicals, are hitting him figuratively upside the head with a 2x4, every day, pounding him about character. The Southern Baptist Convention is passing resolutions on the importance of moral character. Now you get Donald Trump, who in many respects makes Bill Clinton look like a Boy Scout, and they not only support him, but they fall in love with him. And people are like confused, like what's going on? And it's a completely legit thing to ask. It's clearly hypocrisy, but I'd say one thing which is important to understand, and Kristen DeMay is a historian at Calvin University and wrote a great book called Jesus and John Wayne, said that what I think a lot of people who are not within the Christian subculture don't realize, which is Trump was in many ways the personification of a certain kind of male Christian warrior. And if you knew the Christian subculture, the books that were being read, the organizations that were created, the mindset that was there, that was very, very real. And they viewed him as a fighter. They would refer to him in 2016 as a kind of Cyrus, not a Jew, but save the Jew, Persian king.
Mm-hmm.
And so Trump may not be a Christian. He may not be have the same manners and mores as we do, but he's a fighter and he hates the same people we hate. And he will bring a gun to a cultural knife fight. And they love that. And that once they made that jump to him, there was no stopping.
Pete, I am so grateful to you for that that historical arc, because it does make things, it helps make sense of what we're living through, to understand that historical track, that it really does, these feelings of resentment and inferiority and sort of below the surface anger against their fellow Americans has deep, deep roots. And you cannot, you can't just gin up hatred out of nothing. You have to have some natural clay to work with, and you're describing it there. It was waiting. George W. Bush appealed to people's better angels, honestly. I mean, he used Christianity and and the support of those people for good, and they were fine with it, but they didn't fall in love.
Right. That is absolutely true.
That
is absolutely true. There was a way in which Trump, and this is one of the worst things he's done. He's done a lot of really, really bad things, but he found a way to unleash the darkest and ugliest impulses in people, including Christians. And this is what you were referring to earlier, which is, the power of leadership, the importance of leadership. And once they made that jump to him, it was vivifying to them. It was like, wow, there's an entire world that we didn't know about, and it was a kind of psychic satisfaction. Get the sense that it was almost kind of life-giving, that Trump made them feel heard, made them feel seen, and even they began to create a narrative in which they were kind of heroes in this own metadrama that they'd created. That for them is part of this idea of this is an existential struggle, and we're part of it, and we're in it. One other thing I'll tell you about, just an anecdote apropos what you said earlier. I was in Stanford doing a panel session just before the 2016 election with Arlie Hochschild, who's a distinguished historian. And she had just done a book. She had spent a lot of years in the Bayou country of Louisiana. And it was, I think, originally on the Tea Party. She wanted to understand the Tea Party. And so hearing her talk about that experience was really interesting because she's liberal in terms of politically her orientation. But she really liked the people that she met, and she saw them in their, complexity and in their full scope. But she told me something on cab ride to the event, and she said, and again, this is like a week or so before the election, 2016. She said, "Pete, the thing you have to understand is these people feel dishonored and they feel disrespected." And I was like, that is exactly it. And when you feel dishonored and disrespected, that catalyzes a whole series of destructive emotions. And part of it is vengeance, part of it is revenge, part of it is hatred, and that has spread and is now really characteristic of American politics in this Trump era.
All right. Let us look forward now. We are 2.5, almost 3 months into this administration. There are things now, after a shocking start. I mean, I don't think anybody, even those of us who were accused of having TDS, were quite ready for how bad it's been. We're beginning to see signs of fraying around the edges, schisms within. So there are reasons to believe that this is not going to be quite the juggernaut going forward that it had been. As we're taping, it's just after Trump has reversed himself on the tariffs. His most recent reversal, shall I say, on the big tariffs, the big so-called reciprocal tariffs. And there are other signs that there are, divisions within the MAGA world. But for those of us who are struggling for and determined to fight for a better country, you go through, in a recent piece in The Atlantic, some of the people that you've been consulting, some of the wisdom you've been seeking about how to go forward. And I'm wondering if you have some reading suggestions for people, or even just life advice about how does the average podcast listener affect the outcome besides writing to their congressman and senator and voting and so forth. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I have reflected on those because I do feel that one of the real dangers now is for a lot of the critics of Trump is a feeling of powerlessness, of loss of human agency. That's a bad place to be. So I think people are looking to do something, but they're not quite sure what that means. And I've asked a lot of people about it. In terms of like people to consult, I mean, I've found myself going back to people that left an imprint on me decades ago, right? So Václav Havel, the great Czech playwright and dissident, then became the president of the Czech Republic. And he's written many books and essays, The Power of the Powerless, Summer Meditations, and others. And Solzhenitsyn, who was a different person in many respects, but in some respects, well, didn't alter the course of the 20th century, but certainly contributed to it with the Gulag Archipelago and his critique of and revelations about the true nature of the evil of the Soviet Empire. And his 1970 Nobel Peace Prize address, where he said one word of truth can change the world. Those people that I've gone back to probably because they resonated with me as a young person, but also because I just felt that there was something deeply and fundamentally true about what they said, which was the importance of speaking up for truth, even if you live in an ocean of lies. In fact, it's more important to do it then. And you have to do it, I think, in part because other people who may not have the platforms that you do need to hear people speak the truth and say 2 and 2 is 4. That's not 2 and 2 is not 5. Because a lot of times I've heard this from a number of people, which is, I thought I was going insane, right? I was like, I can't believe what's happening, and I can't believe what I'm being told, and I can't believe what other people are saying.
Isn't it
So,
in 1984 where Orwell says that the party dictates that 2 + 2 is 5?
exactly.
And the good party, the citizen must cheerfully assent.
Exactly. That is exactly right. And that's really, we're in a kind of Orwellian moment. I mean, it's been used too often over the decades, but this is genuinely Orwellian, what Trump and MAGA world is trying to do. So 1984 actually does offer kind of insights into that. So one is, I think, that people speaking out in whatever capacity they have for truth, because truth is always worth defending, even in its own right. Even if you're not successful, it's still important to do. It's important to stand for the right things. But it also gives inspiration and encouragement and rootedness to other people. A second thing that I tend to think about is just some measure of patience. History is not linear. There are inflection points in the life of a nation, just like in the life of an individual. And sometimes you can make an argument that just doesn't have traction at one time, and at a different moment, it has all the traction in the world. You may have had this experience, with an essay or a column that you wrote that, if it would have done a year earlier or a year later, it wouldn't have really gotten much attention. But you speak to the moment, you give voice to capture a moment, and people are like, "Oh yeah, that's right."
Yeah,
that can happen in a country too. I think that the gravity is going to pull Trump down. The whirligig of time gets his revenge. I think that's going to happen. I even think in a way what's happened with tariffs was interesting phenomenon, right? What it showed is that Donald Trump, for all of the conspiracy theories, the efforts of intimidation, the lies, crashed against reality. It turns out that stock markets and bond markets can't be intimidated by angry social media posts. reality is reality, and he can't change it. And if my supposition is right about him and what I think is this sort of freak show, clown show that he's got these sort of third-rate people around him, and the chaos, the capriciousness that we're seeing, the impulsivity of it, that's just going to have consequences, and that is going to translate into, unfortunately, a real cost, including costs in human lives, degradation of the country, economic problems, potentially infectious diseases, national security, and so forth. And there will be a comeuppance. Then then there will be a moment, and we just have to be ready and prepared. Kind of, readiness is all to begin to take advantage and say, at this moment in time, this is what's required, including protests. Now, the dangers in all of this is that I believe, and I'm saying this descriptively, not pejoratively, I think that Trump is a vindictive, narcissist, a sociopath. So, as your colleague JVL has talked about, it's kind of a wounded animal. So if the walls begin to close in on sociopaths, they can become very, very dangerous. And that can happen with Trump. Now, I'm not predicting martial law or the Insurrection Act or ignoring a Supreme Court case and order, but they could, and we'll just have to wait and see and determine at those moments in time what's going to be needed. The other thing to do is just historically look back at America and other countries of rupture and repair. We've been through really, really hard times. The 1850s. The first contested election in America, really, was Adams and Jefferson in the 1800s, which is just a vicious affair. The 1960s, late 1960s, I'm a little young to remember what that was like, but knowing about it, having been alive at the time and hearing people and reading about it, you had in a half decade or so, extraordinary cultural and political convulsions happened.
So I'm old enough to remember the 60s. I was a child, but we lived in Newark, New Jersey, and it was right on the verge of when there were terrible riots in Newark. We moved to the suburbs to get away from the violence. And I remember sitting in my suburban house, which was maybe, 5 or 10 miles away from Newark, and watching on television as armored personnel carriers were riding down the street where I had lived a few short months before. So that's how bad it was. And I saw it with my own eyes.
Yeah. I wonder, have you thought about how that shaped you politically?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Because I grew up with a real awareness for how fragile things are, and that, disorder and lawlessness and overweening government and mobs can take just spring up out of nowhere. And your normal, beautiful life that you think is so impregnable is not. That the veneer of civilization is actually very thin.
Yeah, that's a powerful anecdote. It is remarkable. I mean, if people, listeners to your podcast, a lot of them are too young to remember. But if you go back, you're right. I mean, you had the Watts riot, I think 65, which spread. So you had civil rights clashes, riots in the streets. You had the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy in 68. You had Johnson withdrawing because of the Vietnam War. You had huge protests with the Vietnam War. 70, 71, you had Kent State. 68, you had the Democratic Convention where there was blood because Mayor Daley had sent out
a riot of cops.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And the sexual revolution and the generation gap, just enormous convulsive changes.
Absolutely.
And by 1980, you had 84, Morning in America. 80, you had Reagan. and the country was on an entirely different trajectory.
Yes.
And those are important to remember too. The present moments, whether they're good or bad, are not permanent moments. And the American capacity for self-renewal is pretty impressive. I mean, it has been one of the qualities of the country we have to keep in mind. Now, my own view, and I've struggled with this, is I feel some measure of shame toward this country now. And as somebody who grew up almost mythologizing America, romanticizing America, probably overdoing it.
Yeah.
I'm not as aware of the darker chapters that existed. Maybe not wanting to admit that they did. I think I have a fair appraisal of that now, but really loving the country, loving what it at its best it stood for, what its ideals were. To see that country that I believed in now standing for what it stands for, having elected Donald Trump, that's hard, and I do think that it's an indictment on the many Americans and the country more broadly. But it's not permanent, and we've got to do what we can to cultivate the antibodies and recover. We've done it before; we can do it again. And whether we're successful or not, we can't know. But you do have some measure of control on whether you're faithful or not. And each of us in our own lives, in our own spheres of influence, have to be faithful to what we know to be true and good and beautiful, and hope in the end that carries the day.
Or to quote Solzhenitsyn, as you did a moment ago, let the lie come into the world, let it even triumph, but not through me.
Amen.
Well, thank you so much, Pete Wehner. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate your wisdom, and you're taking the time to share it with our listeners.
Thanks, Mona. I'm grateful for you and your work, and we'll continue in the struggle ahead, and hope for the best.
Great to be in a foxhole with you.
Amen. Take care.
Take care.